Today we shall learn a new chapter in English literature. I Am Born, adapted from David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. First, let's read the chapter followed by the summary. I Am Born, adapted from David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. The book is about the life of David Copperfield and is told by David himself. David was born in England around the year 1820. His father had died 6 months before he was born. Here he talks about the time just before he was born. His great aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, comes to visit his mother for the first time after the death of his father. My great aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, was the only person alive on my father's side of the family. She lived alone in a cottage in a small village on the sea coast. My father was once her favorite nephew, but not after he got married. She was angry because he had married a very young woman. My father never saw his Aunt Betsy again. A year after the marriage, my father died. One evening before I was born, my mother was sitting by the fireside. She looked up and saw a strange lady coming up the garden path. She at once knew that it was Miss Betsy Trotwood, as she had heard about her from my father. Miss Trotwood held herself very straight as she walked up to the house with a serious face. Instead of ringing the doorbell, she looked through the window, pressing her nose against the glass. My poor mother was very frightened at this strange behavior. She got up from her chair at once and stood behind it. Miss Betsy ordered her to let her in, and my mother went to the door. "Mrs. David Copperfield, I think," she said. "You have heard of Miss Trotwood, I'm sure." "Yes, please come in," said my mother. "Take off your cap, child," said Miss Betsy, "and let me see you." My mother obeyed, and she did so. Her thick, beautiful hair fell all about her face. "Why, bless my heart!" exclaimed Miss Betsy. "You are just a baby." My mother looked very young for her age. She hung her head as though it was her fault and began to cry. She thought she felt my aunt touch her hair with a gentle hand. When she looked up, Miss Betsy was seated with her legs stretched out and looking at the fire. "What do you call your girl?" "I don't know whether it'll be a girl," said my mother. "I don't mean that," said my aunt. "I mean your servant girl." "Peggotty," said my mother. "Peggotty?" replied my aunt. "How on earth did she get such a name?" "It's a surname, madam," said my mother. "Peggotty, could you fetch your mistress some tea?" cried Miss Betsy, going to the door. "She is not well. Hurry!" "You were speaking about the child being a girl," said Miss Betsy. I've no doubt it will be a girl. Now, child, from the time of the birth of this girl, perhaps boy, my mother said. I'll tell you it will be a girl, returned Miss Betsy. From the time of the birth of this girl, I am going to be her friend. I want to be her godmother. You should call her Betsy Trotwood Copperfield, as she should be well brought up. Can you keep accounts and take care of a house? Yes, I can. Not much, but Mr. Copperfield was teaching me. And my mother broke down. No, no, don't cry any more, said Miss Betsy. You will make yourself ill, and that'll be bad for you and your baby. You mustn't do that. This quietened my mother. What has your husband left you? Asked Miss Betsy a short while later. Mr. Copperfield left me an income of £105 a year, madam, said my mother. Peggotty came in with the tea. She saw how ill my mother looked and sent for the doctor at once. When Mr. Chillip, the doctor, and Peggotty took my mother upstairs to her room, Miss Betsy sat in the living room waiting. Hours passed. Mr. Chillip came downstairs. He saw Miss Betsy walking up and down the room. Well, doctor, how is she? Asked Aunt Betsy. Mrs. Copperfield is quite as comfortable as we can expect a young mother to be. You will soon be able to see her. And she? How is she? Said Aunt Betsy. Mr. Chillip did not seem to understand. The baby, said my aunt. How is she? Madam, returned Mr. Chillip, I thought you knew. It's a boy. My aunt did not say a word. She put on her bonnet and walked straight out of the house. She never came back again. And that was how I, David Copperfield, was born. I Am Born is the first chapter of the novel David Copperfield, written by Charles Dickens. The story read is an extract taken from this chapter where Junior David Copperfield narrates in his voice the circumstances of his birth. David Copperfield was born in Blunderstone Rookery, the name of his house in England, on Friday around the year 1820. Just before David's birth, Miss Betsy Trotwood, his great-grand-aunt, made her first visit to Blunderstone Rookery after his father's death. His father was her favorite nephew, but when he married his mother, Clara, she was angry with him because David's mother was young and half of his age. Miss Betsy was so angry with his marriage that she never saw him again. On the day when David was about to be born, his mother Clara was sitting by the fire, feeling miserable being young, pregnant, and alone in the world, as his father died 6 months before David's birth. Suddenly, Clara sees a woman coming up to the house and was startled at the surprise visit of this fearsome lady, Miss Betsy Trotwood. But later she finds her to be kind and strong. Taking command of the household, Miss Trotwood orders Peggotty, the Copperfield servant girl, to make some tea for Mrs. Clara Copperfield. Miss Betsy then asked Mrs. Copperfield how she managed her household. Mrs. Copperfield admits she doesn't know much about keeping accounts, but informs Miss Betsy that Mr. Copperfield was a good person and left an income of £105 per year for her and her unborn child. Miss Betsy then insists that the expected child will be a girl. She declares that the new baby girl will be named Betsy Trotwood Copperfield. She states with authority that she would be her godmother and promises to take the responsibility of her education. She wishes to protect the child from the heartaches and disappointments of her own life. Already agitated by impending birth of the baby and the death of David's father, Mrs. Copperfield, further troubled by the abrupt appearance and manner of Miss Trotwood, she becomes ill with labor pain. Peggotty, when she enters the room with tea, finds Mrs. Copperfield not keeping well, sends her nephew Ham Peggotty for a doctor. In the meantime, Miss Betsy sits in the living room. The doctor, Mr. Chillip, arrives and checks on Mrs. Copperfield, who was upstairs, and then comes down to the living room to sit with Miss Betsy. Miss Betsy was nervous and was yelling at Mr. Chillip in agitation. Finally, Mr. Chillip tells Miss Betsy the baby has been born and also brings her the news that it is a boy, not a girl, as Miss Betsy had assumed. At this, Miss Betsy hits Mr. Chillip with her bonnet and walks out the door without a word and disappears from David's life for quite a while.